Well, hello and welcome back to the Cincy Reformed Podcast. My name is Zac Wise. I'm here with my co-pastor Brandon and we are continuing our series today on some of the ways that the Reformed tradition is distinct from the Baptistic tradition. We're using Baptistic in a broad way to refer to churches that might be formally Baptist or they might be more just evangelical, but there are some things that really unite them together, and one of the ways that you find a sense of unity amongst the Baptistic tradition is that they are independent from one another, and in the way that the churches there are governed, oftentimes called congregationalism, but we're going to kind of get into that here today. So Brandon, could you start to talk to us, introduce us to the way that the Baptistic tradition tends to structure and govern their churches?
Yeah, so the Baptists, they have a view of autonomy. They have a view of, you might even say radical autonomy, where each church is independent and there is no authority outside of the local body, and they try to avoid anything that looks like a Roman Catholic hierarchy or Episcopal hierarchy, where you have bishops and archbishops. They don't like things like Presbyterianism, where a presbytery might hover over the local church or something like that. So they're really kind of eschewing those models of church government, and they believe that the local church is autonomous and independent, and there can be nobody outside to come in and tell that church what to do or what to say or what not to do. So a place in the Baptist Faith and Message where they unpack this, they say, a New Testament church of the Lord Jesus Christ is an autonomous local congregation of baptized believers associated by covenant in the faith and fellowship of the gospel, observing the two ordinances of Christ, governed by his laws, exercising the gifts, rights, and privileges invested in them by his word, and seeking to extend the gospel to the ends of the earth. Each congregation operates under the lordship of Christ through democratic processes. In such a congregation, each member is responsible and accountable to Christ as Lord. And so, for the Baptists, there's this democratic process where the congregation, every member of the congregation is just directly responsible in how they vote to Christ. You could say the keys of the kingdom are being held amongst the congregation in these democratic processes. The Baptist Faith and Message goes on to say, Christ's people should, as occasion requires, organize such associations and conventions as may best secure cooperation for the great objects of the kingdom of God. Such organizations have no authority over another church or over the churches. They are voluntary and advisory bodies designed to elicit, combine, and direct the energies of our people in the most effective manner. So Baptists encourage people to do fellowship and have churches in fellowship with one another, even to join an association that might be a body that helps to associate the many different churches, but there is no power whatsoever in the association. I guess you could say the only power the association might have is to disassociate, is to say, well, we're going to withdraw our association from that church, but they have no authority over that church in any way to come into the church or to speak into the church about good practices or what they should or should not do. They have no authority to speak like that at all. It is only advisory, it is only voluntary, and there, as it says, no authority. The association has been stripped of all authority. The only authority is the democratic processes of all the individual members who are directly under the lordship of Christ and responsible to Christ. And that's kind of how they structure churches. Again, like you mentioned, often called congregationalism. But Zac, how do we differ? How is the Reformed not congregationalist?
Sure. Well, when we begin to think about the keys of the kingdom, I'm glad you brought that up as speaking about the congregation there. That's a good place to start, because we do not believe that the congregation, in terms of all the members, individually hold the keys of the kingdom directly to make ecclesiastical judgments and decisions, and that the final authority rests there. But rather, we believe that the keys of the kingdom are held by the officers of the church instead. We see that in the Old Testament. We see that Christ is giving them to the apostles in Matthew 16 and 18. And that is in continuity with the Old Testament expectation, where there are officers who serve in a capacity of authority is given to them by way of ordination. And so when we think about authority within the church, we're thinking about a plurality of elders that are serving there, both teaching elders and ruling elders, or they could be called ministers and elders, that together they come together to be the shepherds of the church. It always strikes me that when I hear congregationalism described and discussed, that really the shepherds in that context, it's the church itself. And then who are the sheep who are being directed? Well, as the congregation takes votes and makes authoritative decisions, well, then the elders then become the ones who are then told what to do. Because, and so it's got it flipped around, who the shepherds and who are the sheep. I mean, it's just it's an unclear thing in my mind as to how that works. But
and how do you rule well?
You can't rule well, can you? Because you're the one being ruled.
Right, as Paul says, and the elders who rule well, if they're not ruling.
It just doesn't make any sense to me. So,
and so to make one clarification too, one caveat, the way in which some Congregationalists would understand this is they would say, well, the elders lead the congregation to exercise the keys. So they make a distinction between leadership and authority. Mm-hmm. So the congregation has the authority, elders just have leadership. But I think that really fuzzies up the line a bit as the congregation is voting. Mm-hmm. Leadership it's just kind of blurring lines here between authority and leadership in ways that it becomes unclear, I think, in practice.
Absolutely, and this I think starts to clarify where the real discontinuities between Old and New Testament come into play. Mm-hmm. Right. Another one would be that we come into our conception of church and we expect there to be visible connectional relationships between local congregations because God's people have always been visibly connected with one another. Now, of course, we'll say that a local church can still be a true local church if it is independent and autonomous. That's, in theory, that can happen, but that's not for the good of the church. The church's well-being is realized when it is connected with others, because that's the pattern we see in the Old Testament. It's the pattern we see in the New Testament. And maybe in a second you can talk to us about Acts 15. But this connectional nature of the church really serves it well. Because as we think about our own denomination, the United Reformed Churches, we exist with real covenantal bonds with one another. So I'm held accountable for what I'm teaching. Our elders are held accountable for the way that they are ruling and leading. And that accountability occurs at Classis, which is our regional assembly, and then at Synod, which is our denominational assembly, where churches and their delegates gather from Canada and from the United States and have a congregation in Mexico. That this happens across church boundaries. And so you can actually hold a leader accountable. Whereas within an autonomous context, you cannot hold leaders accountable. But they can go rogue and do whatever they want. Local churches can do whatever they want. And there's no teeth to bring them to account and to hold their feet to the fire. And so again, leadership really matters. Rule matters within our context. And that there's accountability for that as well within a plurality. So Brandon, maybe reflect on Acts 15 for us, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think Acts 15 is a clear example of this. So there was a debate that was happening in the early church about the relationship of works, of the law of Moses and being saved and justified. And you had some who were saying to be saved, you have to keep the laws of Moses. And so that was being debated, and the apostles met, but they called elders of the churches to come. And so churches sent their elders. They met at the Jerusalem Council. They deliberated on the matter. They came up with a document that kind of outlined what the council declared, and then it went back authoritatively to all of the local congregations. So there's an example in the Bible of an assembly, kind of like our classis or synod, that where as the delegates, as the elders are meeting and deliberating on matters and then sending that back to the churches. And now some Congregationalists will look at Acts 15 and they'll say, well, that's not programmatic for the church. That's a one-time thing. That was an apostolic thing. It has no real relevance to how we practice things here today. But I don't think that's the case, and I think that the apostles were. I think one of the reasons of including the elders is to show them how to carry on in the future. Because if it was just a one-time apostolic thing, they didn't need the elders. They could have just deliberated amongst the apostles, sent out an apostolic letter, but they were showing the elders. They were showing the local congregations. This is how you settle disputes. This is how you debate things. This is how you get things done. You come together as a regional body. You debate things, you make a declaration, and then you send that authoritative declaration to the churches. And so the idea of autonomy, you just don't see New Testament churches shouting their autonomy from the rooftop. They're always connected. There is outside authority, and the outside authority does speak authoritatively into your local congregation. And so the idea of just complete independency doesn't really make a lot of biblical sense, I don't think.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. And I think that's a couple other things we might want to note here as we think about the difference in terms of how the church then functions practically. Is that, and we've mentioned the kind of idea of rogue pastors or abusive pastors. There's a structure to deal with it. We make the caveat to say that just because there's a structure in place does not mean it's always infallible, that's perfect. We're not saying that. But at least a structure exists to address an abusive leader or somebody who is theologically going off the rails, or if there's a situation of maybe financial need, that's a place where we can think about too. The structure exists whereby a needy church can make appeals to receive funding from other churches or from maybe central accounts that are being held. If there's a church planting work, I know that our church here in Cincinnati was greatly benefited, and our two church plants in Indianapolis right now and Madison, Indiana right now, that those are being greatly benefited by some shared funds that we have with one another, and we have procedures by which we can access those funds and have them granted to us by our regional assembly. So those kinds of things are in place to help with missionary works and with sending missionaries to different places. It's much easier when you have structures in place and governance in place that goes beyond the autonomous local church. Likewise, if you have a discipline case where maybe somebody is being disciplined, it cannot be done overnight where you rock up to Sunday and all of a sudden you're being excommunicated and there's no procedure in place. But we actually have lines of appeal where if somebody is being disciplined, then they can make appeals then to higher courts, to broader assemblies, to classis and to synod, to make sure that their name is not being dragged through the mud. If someone's being disciplined wrongly, we should know about that. We should care about that. And so again, there's a way of appealing to others to make sure that discipline does not go wrong, does not go off the rails.
Yeah, I mean, because if you're in a congregationalist setting, and the eldership or the one pastor, or however it's structured, kind of goes off the rails, who can stop them? I mean, maybe the congregation, but it's going to be very messy. They're not going to have the resources and the structures in place to do it. Whereas we have structures in place. We have outside courts and outside authorities. And in a congregationalist, there's nobody outside who can come in and do anything authoritatively. They might be able to advise or something, but there's nothing authoritatively that can be done. And then again, too, if a pastor wrongly kind of, kicks a person out. Like, what are they going to do? They can't appeal to any higher court in the church to vindicate themselves. And so you miss out on that, I think, as well. And I like what you mentioned, too, about how we have processes to get money or funding for various things, discipline cases. What are some other things, maybe, that kind of is problematic in the Congregationalist realm?
Well, I think that this might not exactly be the Congregationalist, but I think maybe one place where we could differ and point out some clear places for continued conversation is the way that we think about ordination really matters here. And I mentioned this before, but it's worth bringing up again. That ordination really is a conference of authority. And that's what we see happening within the biblical text, Old and New Testaments. That office matters. And that office is not something to be rushed into quickly. But really, it is God working in a special way through an office. And an office bearer takes that office upon himself and then begins to serve in a special way as Christ's hands and feet within a sphere of authority. So we have teaching elders, we have ruling elders, and we have deacons, and they operate with real authority. And that teaches us then of how to look not just to the under shepherd, but then it teaches us how to look at the chief shepherd, who is Jesus Christ. And we can know that he is ministering to us through those offices as they are conducted appropriately and biblically, that we know that then Christ is meeting us in that place as well. I don't think that there is that organic way of thinking within a Congregationalist setup, because again, the authority is held by each and every individual Christian in the same way. And so you can't view office in an exalted fashion in that context. So that's another thought I have. How about you, Brandon?
Yeah, the way that some of the bylaws of some of these congregational churches read, you could hypothetically have somebody who walks off the street, comes to your church, walks down an aisle, and gets saved. And then they come back that evening for the business meeting, and they're voting on important matters of the church, holding the keys of the kingdom, and they've been a Christian for a couple hours and have no idea what's happening. And in situations like that, you could have almost like a blind leading the blind. And there's, I've seen churches where they wanted to vote to bring on a pastor who just got out of prison because he abused his last church. Or they want to, I've seen churches where they want to vote to deny a key doctrine of the faith. Like, we're going to reject original sin, one church declared. Now, in a more connectional way that we have, that those things would not be permitted. You would not be able to reject key tenets of the faith, and it's a way to protect the church, to protect the pastor. It protects the name of Christ even. And in a congregational setting, you can have all kind of just weird things happen because there's really no structure outside to deal with the radical things that can happen. And even from a kind of experiential avenue, when I was a Baptist pastor, I really wanted to have a book of church order. Because oftentimes, if you're the single pastor in a Baptist church and you decide to do something this way or do something that way, well, you have phone calls and everybody's mad. How come you did it this way? How come you did it that way? But when you have a book of church order that tells you how we operate, what we do, what are the procedures, you have something to appeal to and say, these are the standards for all of our churches, this is what we do, and this isn't just me coming up with something where I'm going to make half the church unhappy or something, but having something that unifies us, like a book of church order, actually helps keep peace and keep everybody stepping on the same tracks, walking in the same direction.
That's helpful. We hope it's been helpful for you as well. Again, we're the Cincy Reformed Podcast. We invite you back next week as we continue this series, thinking about some of the differences between the Reformed tradition and the Baptistic tradition. But check us out online at cincyreformed.org, and we are sponsored by Westside Reformed Church at westsidereformed.org. Thanks again for joining us today. Bye-bye.